Hello and welcome to 18 WJTS Inform. I'm your host, Bill Potter. Joining me in the studio is State Senator Mark Messmer, who joins us on Friday nights during legislation, representing District 48, to talk about what has happened in legislation this week. And Senator, welcome to the show.
Great to be here as always.
Thank you. And this week, I guess really the biggest news probably out of legislation is the Bias Crimes Bill, or some refer to it as the Hate Crimes Bill.
Correct.
And it's passed and has been signed.
Yes, we passed it. The changes to the Senate bill that came back. We passed it in the Senate on Tuesday afternoon, and on Wednesday the governor signed it. So it is law. And a little background on that issue. I mean, it's some people call it hate crimes, or I mean the correct term would be it's a bias crime aggravator that a judge can use during sentencing of a felony. So if you commit a felony, battery, murder, whatever, a variety of felonies that you could be convicted of it, but it's typically going to be assault, battery, or murder, something to that level, something violent. There's always a sentencing range that our criminal courts codes over the past years have gone through, and every crime has a range of sentences from, just say for assault and battery, say the average range was 10 to 20 years. The recommended sentence is 15. So I mean they always give you a range. Maybe for murder it might be 20 years to 50 years, or so there's always a range, and then a recommended sentence. It's usually right in the middle of it. And there can be mitigating circumstances. Maybe it's your first time offense, maybe whatever. I mean, whatever sentences, long-standing, upstanding citizen, there can be mitigating factors that a judge can reduce from the maximum, or there can be aggravating factors that allows them to increase up to the maximum. And by court precedent, there was a Whitworth case back in 2003, I believe. Not for sure, but I think it was around that range, where the Supreme Court said, in that particular case, that yes, the judge could go to the maximum sentence because there was a racial bias in that crime. And so the Supreme Court back then said judges can use aggravating circumstances, bias, in the sentencing by court precedent, but we didn't have anything in law that said it. And so the criticism in Indiana against Indiana has been, you don't have a bias crime, you don't have a hate. Some people call it a hate crime, but it's a bias. Was there any kind of bias? Was it racial bias, age bias, male, female, religious? Was there some type of reason, that came, and it has to come up during the trial. A judge has to say, because of testimony of what the person said, maybe something they posted on social media, before they committed the crime, that indicated, some type of hatred to some type of group, or that, and that was an aggravating factor in that felony, and allows the judge to take it up to the maximum sentence within the current legal sentencing parameters that are in law. There's, I think, 10 or 11 other, aggravating factors in law already. Bias just becomes the 12th, and actually age, is already one of the aggravating factors, and the biases that we had listed in Senate Bill 198 included, race, religion, creed. I mean, there's, the list of other aggravating traits that a judge can consider, but the law as it's written says included but not limited to these list of traits. So really, people could say, well, that gives the courts flexibility as time goes on. If there's some other type of trait or bias that they think is appropriate, they can include that's an aggravating circumstance in any conviction after it's been convicted in the sentencing phase. Now, some states have a standalone hate crime law where you have the trial, you convict the person of the offense, and then you have to have another trial, to show, that it was a hate crime. So when people call it a hate crime, Indiana, with now about 43 of the other 45 states, have it as an aggravator in sentencing, and it allows bias for the traits that we have listed, or any other trait a judge would want to think was appropriate to use it as an aggravator during the sentencing phase.
Is this since the governor signed it, is it law now?
It's law now.
Or is it one in July? Okay, so it's law now.
Upon passage, yep. Okay. So it's law now. So anybody who has a bias against them, when you could be walking down the street and they say, I hate all media people, and pound the heck out of Bill Potter walking down the street.
Please don't.
Now, you could potentially, sure. I mean, it could be, there was a shooting, out on the East Coast where a guy went into a newsroom because he thought the media was biased, and he was, so, I mean, the type of bias could be something like that, but it's usually going to be it'll be an act of terrorism, it'll be an act of, battery, assault battery, murder. I mean, it's going to be some type of violent felony. I mean, or it could be a criminal trespass like they had in the Jewish synagogue in Annapolis, where they defaced the synagogue. I mean, that whether that would elevate to a felony level or not, I'm not sure, but
it was biased. So
it was biased. So that, I mean, it could be. So that was probably the most significant bill, and we had heard from the minority communities for years that we needed to do this, and actually the Senate passed something very similar to this in 2016, but the House just wouldn't hear it. And 2017, 18, they said, we're not going to hear it, so just don't send us anything. Well, this year we started the bill, sent it over to them, but by the time we got done and sent it to them, because we really wanted to force the House to act on it, because we'd done it before, and if they're not going to act on it, I mean, there's no use for us to push it. So we basically said in Senate Bill 12 when it started that a judge can consider bias when when applying a sentence, and it was a little too generic. We knew that, but it was basically pushing the ball into the House court,
so then they can
forcing
change it
them
their
to do
way.
something with it.
Yeah. Okay.
So it worked, and the bill is law now. So we had been one of the 5 states that didn't have a bias crime aggravator. Now we've got it, and the business community said it was an impediment for them in recruiting, workforce to Indiana. The minority, classes of people said it was, they could be, they were being mistreated on, for bias and didn't have protection, which technically they did. But now judges will have, clear guidance on applying, bias in the sentencing phase. So nice to have that done.
There were some other bills that came up?
Yep, we had a couple of bills that, for me, it's an area of interest, and I think for most people in our area, pro-life bills that we passed this year. One was House Bill 1211, and it makes it a felony to do a dismemberment abortion. That's a late-term abortion where they, take the baby out piece by piece. And clear evidence in the medical community that once the baby's developed past about 20 weeks, that it can feel pain. Had a friend who had a baby with spina bifida, and at about 23, 24 weeks, they went in and did surgery, in the womb, but they have to administer, anesthesia, pain treatment to that child before they operate on it, because it can clearly feel pain. Well, our position from the state is that if that child can feel pain, that's a cruel, torturous, way to do it. And some other states have passed it. I don't know that it's not been challenged in court yet. It probably will be, but there's no Supreme Court precedent that says, states are prohibited from, if you have a compelling interest in defending or stopping an abortion practice. I mean, we think it's within court precedent that we can ban that procedure. We'll see. It'll probably get challenged in court, and who knows, what the federal courts will do with it. But we felt it was the right policy to do for Indiana. And then another bill that gives anybody in the medical field It was Senate Bill 201. Came back, had some slight changes in the House. Came back and allows any nurse, any medical staff, any pharmacist that has a moral objection to participating in an abortion, the right to have a moral objection clause, and they can't be fired by their employer for refusing to participate in abortion. Doctors had that protection before, but only the doctor themselves could object. A hospital could force any medical staff to nurse anesthetist, anesthesiologist. I mean, any other medical person could have been required to participate in abortions or be fired, and this will give all medical field personnel that moral objection opt out. So good for the people who personally have objections to it to be able to refuse not to do it. So and then an interesting bill, and because I would not have thought this was a problem, because around here a municipality under House Bill 1347 has to allow a renter to come in and put the utilities for the unit that they're renting in their name. Some municipalities made it, required it to be the owner and did not allow the renter to have the utilities put in their name. Well, if they moved out, didn't pay their last utility payment, instead of them pursuing the renter, if it was only under the owner's name, then the owner had to pay, the last month or two, whatever they skipped out on. So House Bill 1347 allows renters to have the utilities put in their name, and I think Huntingburg, Jasper, and Ferdinand. I mean, everybody around here that I know of has always allowed it, but evidently some municipalities were not. So
now they will have to.
Now they will have to allow that. And then House Bill 1114, which was up for final passage on Thursday, but the Senate sponsor was out, but I'm sure it will pass. In the case of attempted murder, a juvenile under the age of 14 can't be waived to adult court for attempted murder. For murder, they can, depending, a judge has the option, depending on the mental ability, the emotional ability, whatever, of the person involved. But I guess the critical nature of that came up in the West Noble school shooting last year. The young man that shot the girl shot her 7 or 8 times, clearly intended to kill her. Shot the teacher that tried to intervene, 2 or 3 times, but couldn't be waived to adult court because attempted murder was not allowable for waiving a child or a 12 or 13-year-old to adult court. For murder, if he would actually killed the girl, he could have. Mm-hmm. But I mean, she'll be paralyzed for life. But she wasn't killed, so the courts didn't have that option. But House Bill 1114 will give judges that discretion. So, feel like, just because he was a bad shot, shouldn't waive that judicial option. They still might decide not to, and there are complications. They have that option with this bill. Had several of my bills progress this week. This was a busy week in committee and on the House floor and on the Senate floor. My Senate Bill 586, the Physical Therapist Practice Act update, hadn't been updated in 62 years, significantly. Came back from the House with a few tweaks, so I'll have that back for a concurrence vote on Monday. It passed nearly unanimously in the House. I think it passed unanimously in the Senate the first half, so that should be smooth sailing. Senate Bill 230 that I had, the initial part of that bill, there was a Supreme Court ruling a couple years ago that made the general contractor liable for unsafe behavior, safety accidents caused by anybody on the job. And Senate Bill 230 resets that back to the last 40 or 50 years of law practice in Indiana, that every contractor on the job is responsible for, if their employee does something that causes an accident or somebody gets hurt, each person on the project is responsible for their behavior. And there was a clause added to that in the House that current practice or recent practice is that some general contractors have been requiring in some of their contracts if they hired an engineer on a project, that engineer pay to defend the general contractor even when there's been, no negligent design of the engineering, personnel. As a contractor, you can always get liability, construction liability that covers those things. But as an engineering company, all they can legally get is insurance to cover their negligent behavior. And there's been a duty to defend clause that some general contractors have been putting when they hire engineering personnel that requires them to pay for the defense of the general contractor. Clearly, an unfair situation where if they make them pay, there's ultimately no negligent behavior of the engineering company, they can't even get reimbursed in court. So that was added to it. We passed that out of the Senate yesterday, 38-9. So glad to see that one done. And then I had a few other bills move out of committee that'll be up for final passage in the House next week.
You're going to have a busy week next week.
Busy week.
Too. All right. Well, Senator, thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure. Always good.
Our guest on Fridays is State Senator Mark Messmer, talking about what's happened in legislation this week and what's going to be happening next week. Thank you, Senator, for coming in. Thank you for watching WJTS Inform. We're local people watching local people.